Hi there, and welcome to the Shure Creators channel, where in this series we're talking about podcasting. I'm Naomi Meller, the founder of the Skylark Collective and the International Women's Podcast Awards, and we're here today aboard the Boat Pod, where we're going to be taking you through the basics of starting a podcast. Welcome to episode 4 of the How to Start a Podcast series from Shure Creators. Hopefully, you've now got a beautiful, shiny audio file of your finished podcast episode sitting somewhere on your laptop. But you've got no idea how to put it out into the world and how it reaches the ears of all those millions of people that want to listen to it. Don't worry, in this episode we're discussing hosting and distribution and how you can make sure that your podcast gets into the ears of the world. The first thing you need to get your podcast out there is an RSS feed. Put simply, an RSS feed is a document that contains all the vital information about your show. The title, the description, the show notes, and the relevant audio files, etc., etc. The RSS sits on a server, and it's the way that people in the public domain will find your show. It allows people to search, follow, download, stream, and subscribe to your show on any of the multitude of podcast apps out there. So how do you get one of these RSS feeds? Well, that happens through what's called a hosting service. Your hosting service will distribute your podcast for you to every app out there every time you upload a new episode to their site. There's heaps of good hosting services. I like Captivate and Libsyn, but lots of people love Buzzsprout or Podbean. There's hundreds. Either way, whoever you use, each time you upload a new episode of your podcast, that's how it ends up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and the rest. That's your hosting service's job. They do the hard work so you don't have to. Contrary to what most people think, you don't have to individually upload each podcast episode to every single app out there. The hosting service will put it from one place out to everywhere. Hosting services are a little bit variable in terms of what they offer, and they're also a little bit variable in terms of their cost. There's lots of fancy add-ons with advertising, analytics, and other options that some of them give you. And to a certain extent, you get what you pay for. Some are free and some are not, but a lot have bells and whistles, advertising options, and analytics. Ask your podcasting buddies or have a look online and you'll find the one that's right for you. As a little recap, because I know it's really confusing, there's multiple steps in the workflow, but just as a little refresher. We record using an MV7. If you're recording remotely, I would use Zencastr as your recording platform. From there, you want to edit, and easy options include Hindenburg, GarageBand, or Audacity for new podcasters. Once you've edited, you then need a hosting service for your distribution. That's where you want to be looking for Captivate, Libsyn, or others. Got it? Great. So your podcast is now out into the world and you need to start telling other people that it exists. How are you going to market your podcast? Wisdom says that you should spend 50% of your time producing your podcast and 50% of your time marketing it. I, for one, do not spend that much time doing my podcast marketing, but we all probably should. Podcast marketing is a massive topic all of its own, but we're going to walk you through a few different options today. Social media is the obvious first choice. Many of us are on it anyway, and many of you will have your own accounts on multiple platforms. If you've got an established following and you're savvy with social media, this can be a really, really good option for getting your podcast out there. Each account for your podcast does take time to curate nicely though. Lots of people ask, should we have individual channels for our podcast? Lots of podcasts do have a social media feed on Instagram or Twitter in particular for their show. So if you've got time and you love social media, by all means, set up a new account for your podcast. If you don't and you hate social media, maybe give it a swerve. One thing to note here that is often said by podcast marketers is that social media traction does not always equate to downloads for your podcast. You might be getting a lot of love on Instagram or a lot of retweets for your posts, but that does not necessarily mean that people are going to go and find your show and listen to it. Just bear that in mind. Social media is useful, but it doesn't necessarily always equate to a big spike in listens. If you've got a huge audience on social media already, either professionally or personally, however, it can be very, very useful. One thing to mention here when we're talking about social media is audiograms. These are the creative, innovative posts that you've probably seen on Instagram or Twitter, where you have an image in the background and a wiggling audio wave over the top. There'll be a clip from the podcast and a person talking normally. Sometimes they're accompanied by a video, but most often they're with a still photo. These are a really nice way to clip out a particularly good section of your show. Something about 30 seconds to a minute of audio, which is going to draw people in and tantalize them with what you're offering. They're really nice, they look great, and you can use them across multiple social media platforms and on your website. This is about repurposing content from place to place. So if you're going to make audiograms, think about where you can use them and how you can make them tick for your brand. If you've got guests on your podcast, then providing them with audiograms and other social media assets can be a really nice way of encouraging them to share the episode when it's released. One thing I would say is that some guests are amazing at marketing that episode for you and some are not. But remember, marketing your podcast is not their job. Their job is to turn up and be an amazing guest on your show. If they've shown up for your recording and they've been a good interviewee, then they have done their job. Marketing is up to you, so don't rely on your guests to market your show for you, particularly if they're a big guest. They might not do it for you, and don't be surprised if they don't share. It's not the end of the world, and it's a really, really common thing not to happen, even when you really want it to. It's definitely worth thinking about the launch of your podcast. One of my biggest mistakes was not to have a podcast marketing plan for my first show. You may hear it said that releasing multiple episodes at the beginning or getting loads of ratings and reviews in your first week or two will really help boost your podcast on the algorithms, the mysterious algorithms. The reality is, like all social media platforms, they change all the time, and nobody knows what the enigma of the algorithm actually is. But ratings and reviews do offer nice social proof for your podcast. They show that people are listening and enjoying your show, and you may get some useful feedback from them from time to time. They're the thing that everybody asks for. If you listen to podcasts at all, you will undoubtedly have been asked to rate and review someone else's show, so there's got to be something in that, right? You might also want to think about getting your podcast in some nice podcasting newsletters. I'm a real big fan of this, and there's some wonderful podcasting newsletters out there. Ariel Nissenblatt from Squadcast, who is one of the most generous people you will ever meet in podcasting, has a newsletter called Earbuds. And Lauren Purcell from Tink Media in New York also runs one called Podcasting the Newsletter. These are great places, amongst others, to get your show featured, and you can apply to do so via some forms on their websites. Pod News, which is run by James Cridland, is also a massive daily podcast newsletter, and podcasts can be featured in there. And the other place to look is Twitter. There's lots of podcast recommendation newsletters available on Twitter, and that is a really good place to look. Various hosting services and podcast publications will often highlight and feature podcasters in their email newsletters as well. So check out things like Podbible in the UK or Podcast the Magazine in the US. Get your name out there. Apply to be featured in these publications. The more you do that, the more likely you are to show up. And the more people hear about you, the more likely they are to listen to your show. Another brilliant way to get the word out about your show is to appear as a guest on other podcasts. Make podcast friends. This is a really, really good method, and podcasters are usually a really friendly bunch. If you find other shows in your genre and approach those hosts about appearing on that show, it's a guaranteed way to expose your show to a like-minded audience. It's far easier to get people who are already listening to podcasts to come and listen to yours than it is to convert non-podcast listeners. I absolutely love appearing as a guest elsewhere, and it's a great way to talk about your podcast, your business, your brand, or anything else you might want to shoehorn in if you can. Appearing as a guest on other people's shows marks you out as a thought leader in your sphere and really offers opportunities for cross-promotion of your own podcast. So make lists of people in your niche. Who do you want to approach? Write a really good pitch email and then personalize it for each show that you approach. Send and repeat. And you will need to send and repeat several times because you probably won't get on every show that you approach to start with. That's okay. But if you keep going and you make yourself a really good guest, you will be everywhere on podcasts before you know it. Think about your podcast listeners as a community. Some of the most successful podcasts out there have become so because their show is a place where people can gather to listen and talk about what they're listening to. Some podcasters will create a secondary place where their listeners can gather. Think Patreon, Discord, or Slack. And some of these places will have opportunities for your listeners to contribute to the running costs of your show. This can be a really nice way for people to just give a small amount per month for a show that they love, and they are super happy to do so. And this will help you cover the running costs of keeping your podcast on the road. We'll go more into monetization in the next episode. And finally, don't forget about your show notes. The show notes are uploaded via your hosting service, and they can be as brief or as comprehensive as you like, but I really recommend that you put a bit of time and effort into them if you can. They might contain a summary of what your podcast episode is about. They might contain a full transcription to really help people that are hard of hearing be a part of your podcast experience. And they might contain links to articles or photos or websites that you've mentioned in the course of an episode. It's really, really helpful if people can find in the show notes what you're talking about. This keeps your listeners really happy. It's tempting to overlook your show notes when you're short of time, but they are the SEO shop window to your podcast. They need to contain the key words about your episode or your show in general so that when people are searching online, your podcast will pop up. Spend some time on them if you can. Make them good. And if they contain keywords, when people are searching, they will find you. That's it for this time. In the next episode, we'll be talking about monetizing your podcast, so don't miss that one. If you've enjoyed this, then subscribe below and don't forget to hit the bell to be notified every time a new episode appears. We'll see you for the next one.